My name is Christos Kydonieus, and welcome to another episode of the Socially Distant Untitled Podcast's newest show, the Post-Podcast Review, or as we at the show like to call it, the PP Review. Now, the point of the review is to provide quick 5 to 10 minute reviews on media we don't get a chance to cover on the podcast, and today we'll be taking a deep dive back to the underwater dystopian city of Rapture, and be reviewing Bioshock 2 Remastered. Now, Bioshock 2 was originally developed by 2K Marine and 2K Australia back in February 9th, 2010, and was released in 2016 as remastered as part of the Bioshock collection. If you noticed, observant viewers, compared to the first game, which was developed by Insomnia Games, you'll see that the original developers didn't work on this game, although there were people who worked on both games. Over the course of its lifespan, Bioshock 2 featured an extensive multiplayer, story-driven campaign, online battles, and a follow-up sequel DLC, or not really follow-up as it is a side story DLC, Minerva's Den. The Bioshock 2 Remastered comes with Minerva's Den if you want to pay an extra $10, which I'll get into later, because it really disturbed me. And the remastered version also did not come with any of the multiplayer content, which was, admittedly, although there may not have been as much of a demand, really upsetting as we missed out on a crucial part of a really interesting part of this game's story. Let's now get into a review. For the first part of the review, we try to give a more surface-level review as to not spoil anything. Then we get into a rating where we rank it compared to other games on a bell curve, and then we get into a more in-depth analysis. To begin the first part of the review, I'd like to expand upon the lack of DLC. Now, admittedly, it's fine that we didn't get the story mode content, which, it's upsetting, but if I'm going to be honest, I don't think I can think of too many friends that want to do it with me, and I'm sure I could watch reviews online or play the original game, but the fact that it didn't come with this Bioshock 2 Remastered kind of shows how little the Bioshock franchise kind of treats this game, which is upsetting because it has a lot of quality content and is considered by some to be one of the best installments in the franchise. However, not coming with Minerva's Den is not very forgiving. It makes zero sense. I was able to get it on a Steam sale for $2, but again, that is very upsetting and is kind of a little bit of a cash grab. Now to get into more of the game about itself. Overall, Bioshock 2 takes a lot from its predecessor. For one thing, it expands on its themes in a very interesting way. As a lot of people who analyze the game realize, the debates and philosophies present in Bioshock 2 really is the next development of those present in Bioshock 1. It shifts from Ayn Rand's theory of objectivism to a more collectivist view. The main characters' views really mimic that of communism and Karl Marx, really focusing on the will of the collective and putting people as a whole before people individually. However, it also does a great job of showing how corruption plays a role in this, even though you have very pure ideological standpoints in the main villains. You kind of see how easily it gets corrupted, especially in the underwater city of Rapture. Again, being a sequel to the game, it shares the same setting, although set 10 years later, and you can really feel the effects. The enemies are more grotesque, they shout more strange things. You can see that over the 10 years you left Bioshock, the world changed. For better or for worse, you see the city get destroyed, and in this game, this isn't really a spoiler, but you spend a lot of time outside of the city, traversing the ocean floor next to it, which provides an interesting perspective on the world. However, despite this new perspective, and despite the advancement of ideals, the game just takes a little bit too much from its predecessor, relying on even just concept art of the first game to make this one. I'll get more into this with the in-depth review, but you can tell that this game was supposed to be a very safe sequel. Although it is still good, it is very safe and doesn't try a lot of new things. It takes the plasmid system and actually makes it a lot more simpler, which I'll get into in the more in-depth review. The game still has the amazing atmosphere, amazing visuals, and a great soundtrack that really boosts the 1950s feel of the game. Although a lot of people dislike the story, that's just a lot of people who are just die-hard fans of the first game and unable to recognize the second game for what it's worth. While the story is weaker and the story is not as woven through the game levels as good as the first game, it's still an amazing story and provides a very cool and interesting perspective on what it means to be family. While some may argue that this is not as strong as the first game and not as disruptive per se, it still is great. I think that's the biggest thing about this game. It's just not as disruptive. It's not as impactful. Everything is being expanded upon or rehashed, and because of that, it doesn't feel as important. The game gets criticized for its beginning, but I'd actually do the opposite. I'd say the beginning of this game does the best as being a sequel, because it shows the new environments and the impacts you as a character had on the first game. I'd actually say that the ending sequence kind of drags with a very not as much important as an ending, if that makes any sense. With that being said, let's put it now on the bell curve. What putting it on the bell curve does is it allows us to compare it to other games, as well as commend it for its virtues while pointing out its flaws. On the bell curve, I would give Bioshock 2 a 3 to a 3.5. Noticing its amazing atmosphere, however recognizing that it really is just a rehash of the first game, the lack of DLC and multiplayer content is kind of disturbing. It doesn't feature the director's commentary that the first game did. And with that being said, though, still features very engaging gameplay, despite it being actually more limited in scope, and I'll get into that now. Let's start with that. In the more in-depth review, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the gameplay. For the first part of the more in-depth analysis, I'll start by talking about the combat. Something I mentioned earlier is that Bioshock 2 really is just a very safe, non-disruptive rehashing and sequel to the first game. And this is very apparent in the gameplay. You see, rather than being just more of a strategy fight game where you first look at the area around you and then move around it, and then you start going to the fight, this game feels a lot more Doomy or FPS-y in the sense that all the plasmids are focused around combat. Your hacking tool now is real time, and you got rid of the engineering tonics. So really, everything is focusing around combat, which is good and bad in a lot of ways. I found myself utilizing a lot more plasmids than I did in the first game, as in the first game I only really used the shock plasmid. In this game I used the fire, and telekinesis, and electrobolt one mostly. But I did use it in a lot more interesting ways. However, again, limited to the combat scenario, as while the gameplay did involve using the plasmids in the environment, perhaps a little bit more than the first game, it just felt a lot more brain dead. Like, you could play this game on a lot more autopilot, where in the first game you had to think a lot more. With that being said, it also gets reflected in the game's story. You see, for each level, the game story comes in the beginning of the level and then at the end of the level, leaving a big gap of really just nothingness in between. Now, during this point, you're supposed to be hunting down and saving the little sisters, and as a big daddy in this game, which honestly kind of makes up for the more combat-focused gameplay, as you are a hulking big daddy, and that's how you would act. Those segments get really, really repetitive very fast. Even more so than the first game, because this time they're just so long. You have to kill the big daddy, you need to save and guard the little sister, and then you get your choice of morality, which comes in, again, at a rehash of the first game. Sure, you're the big daddy more so in this game, as this game's story revolves around you saving your little sister, but it just gets too repetitive too quick, and it very drags on until very much so nearing the end of the game. I remember I boot into a new level, see how many little sisters there are, and just groan that I'd have to do that much work. The little sisters also bring me into a little bit of a complaint of this game, and it's at the ending. While the ending sequence can be a little bit too long, it is very good. And your interactions with the little sister that you saved, that you're bonded to as a Alpha Series Big Daddy, Eleanor, is a really cool sequence. You know, you're fighting around, but it's just kind of anticlimactic. There's no big final boss fight, which, I mean, games don't need to have, but there was not a sense of urgency as it was just running around. There are 8 endings for this game, but it really feels like there's only 2, and it feels like your choices throughout the games were not that meaningful, if that makes sense. Right, like in the first game there were really 2, maybe 3 endings, and granted, there are a lot more endings in this game, but they have the same, like, conditions, and don't really change much. Right, like in the first game, the endings showed a pretty clear picture of what's to come, and really made you reflect on what you did. While this one, yes, it shapes around how you impacted your little sister and the fate of Eleanor Lamb, but that doesn't get really expanded upon. It just kind of leaves you wanting more. And with that being said, it's still a good ending. It's just anticlimactic, and the endings don't feel that important. With that being said, though, that kind of leads me to another complaint about this game, which is that your choices throughout the game never really feel impactful. There are 3 NPCs that you interact with, and you get to choose their fate, which play a role in the ending of the game. However, not so much the choices you made, but the impact it had on the little sister, which is very cool, very interesting, but it's like, well, I just saved this NPC's life, and they're not going to talk to me at all for the rest of the game, which is very, like, disturbing. I saved this person's life, and yet they don't recognize me or talk to me for the rest of the game, which is kind of daunting, to be honest. And with that being said, Lamb gets very boring throughout the game. You know, like, at the end of it, you're like, oh, just, come on, let me either kill you, or actually, you don't even get the choice to kill her or not. Your little sister gets the choice, which, I mean, does play back to the familial roles, and ultimately the idea of collectivism as a whole, but it just kind of falls flat. One more thing to add about this game is about the character designs. It's kind of goofy, it's a lot more cartoony, you're a lot stronger than everyone, and sometimes your guns do either a ton of damage or 0 damage, although compared to the first game, I did find myself using every single weapon a lot more. And there isn't as much power creeping, but, like, you just get kind of bored of these enemies, because they're a lot more cartoony. In the director's commentary of the first game, they make it a point that you're fighting humans that are disturbed and destroyed by this reality. But now they're, like, kind of more grotesque, but not in a very good way. You're like, sure, the splicing had to have destroyed these splicers, and yes, they are physically... their physical appearance reflects this, but, like, the big beefy guys just look like... it doesn't feel like you're fighting drug addicts anymore, as it is you're fighting cartoony monsters. And it kind of makes the game a lot less scary and takes away from the atmosphere, but it does add to the overall impact that your character's decisions of the first game had, and does make... I mean, it makes fighting them more real as a Big Daddy. It's kind of cool. I know I've kind of torn apart this game a little bit throughout this review, but let me reiterate, this game is still a great game. I'd recommend playing it if you enjoyed the first one. I don't think I could recommend playing it as your first time. And that's just a rehash. It's just a little recap of this review. It's a little bit too much of a rehash of the first game. Its combat gameplay kind of restricts your freedom. Should have come with the DLC. Having to pay 10 more bucks is just unfair. Although Minerva's Den is so far the best Bioshock content I've experienced, although I haven't played Infinite yet. I'll straight up say that. And yeah, it's a good, safe, non-disruptive follow-up to the first game, and it delivers on what it wanted to convey. It's still a good game. I'd recommend it. Again, a 3 to a 3.5 out of 5 on the bell curve. Thank you all for watching once again. My name is Christos Kydonieus. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the PP Review.